Hey guys, today is an amazing episode, and I just want to give our speaker a proper introduction because it was such an honor to have Dr. Bob Schuetz on the podcast today. You're going to learn so much from him. In case you don't know about Dr. Bob Schuetz, he is the founder of the John Paul II Healing Center, where he and his team provide healing and equipping conferences for married couples, clergy, religious, and lay leaders. Bob has been serving married couples for the past 40 years as a marital therapist and conference speaker. He and Jake Kim also host a popular podcast called Restore the Glory, and he is an author of several popular books, including Be Healed, Be Transformed, Be Devoted, and Real Suffering. These are amazing resources for anybody wanting to learn more about woundedness and healing, and today's episode is just packed with amazing advice and wisdom, especially in the topic of healing and woundedness in marriage. So I hope you enjoy. Let's get started.
Hey, I'm your host, Mari Wagner, and you're listening to the Ever Be podcast, where faith meets lifestyle. I'm so excited you're here. Whether you're a new listener or a longtime follower, I know there's something here for you. Pull up a chair and listen in for insightful, real-life conversations and actionable steps on how to claim the full life God created you for. If you're a woman desiring to live a Christ-centered life in today's modern world, then this is for you. Welcome to the Ever Be podcast. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Ever Be. Today, we have a wonderful guest, Dr. Bob Schuetz. You may have heard of him before, and it is such an honor to be able to sit down with you today, Bob, and just chat about marriage, the beauty of it, and the reality that we all have wounds. We all come in with woundedness, and those things come up in our marriage. And so we're going to chat today about how to identify those, maybe how to begin a healing process, how to support each other in our marriages as we go through healing and discovering just more about ourselves. So thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today about this. Can you give us a little bit of an introduction of who you are and maybe how you even got into this line of work?
Well, first of all, thanks, Mari. It's great to be with you, and thank you for all you're doing in terms of spreading the message and communication, integrating the faith with life. Um,
Yeah.
well, I'm Bob Schuetz. I'm right now. I've been widower for the last 8 years, but we were married. Margie and I were married for 42 years, and we have two
Mm.
daughters and 11 grandchildren. And
Beautiful.
I'm grateful that my daughters and their husbands and my grandchildren live nearby, except for the three oldest who are graduated and off to college or beyond. So they're part of my life every day, and it's been just a real gift to have family here. I also have brother and sister in town and their families, and so family is very important, and it's been important for a long time. Some of how I got involved in family ministry is I was uh, we had a very solid Catholic family, it seemed, until uh, things fell apart between my mom and my dad. And I look back and I see how my passion for marriage was formed in that brokenness.
Yeah.
And I remember being in high school at Chaminade High School in South Florida at the time, and the priest was teaching about a course on religion and family, religion and psychology, but it was particularly focused on marriage and family. And I just remember my heart coming alive as I saw those two things come together. And so that's where the spark came for this as a profession. I went to graduate school, I went to college and didn't really have that kind of emphasis. And it was when I was in graduate school that in a marriage and family program that I began to see the possibility. And I didn't know whether I was gonna be a therapist or a teacher of marriage and family, and it turned out that it was both. So I spent,
Mm.
uh, 35, 38 years, teaching marriage and family in different settings, and also uh, being a marriage and family therapist, which meant involving not just couples, but families and individuals. And then started the John Paul II Healing Center, which is what we're doing now. And so we, among other things, we provide marriage conferences for couples, for married couples. I think that's how you got connected, right? Is through a marriage
Yes.
conference? Yes.
Well, a few of your retreats, I was first I mean, I had heard about, yeah, the ministry of that. I was a focus missionary at Lincoln, Nebraska, and
Oh,
actually, I think
yeah.
it's your brother Bart.
Yep, that's my brother Bart, yeah.
Like, Bart came to Lincoln, and he did kind of like a Holy Spirit, um, workshop with us and our students, and then shortly after, or maybe it was a few months after, something was when I attended the Undone retreat in Washington, back in my home parish, and then last year
Which
or a
was
year and
my
a half
daughter
ago.
Carrie. That was my daughter Carrie.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
I met your daughter, Carrie, and then about a year and a half ago, my husband and I went to Unveiled, which was held in Colorado.
Oh, okay.
And I know y'all are coming back out here soon, so we're excited. We have a lot of friends that are going to that, but I've
Oh, great.
also, you're an author, and Be Healed is a very popular book in the Catholic world. So I've heard a lot about that one as well. I haven't read it yet. To be honest, I'm a little intimidated to read it. People have told me, like, you gotta be ready to dive in. So it's definitely on my reading list. But can you tell us a little bit about, just quickly, about that book?
About Be Healed? Yeah, it's really interesting because I was writing a textbook for marriage and family about 40 years ago, and a woman walked in, never met her, and she said, "Are you writing a book?" And I said, "Yeah, how did you know?" She said, "Well, I didn't know. God told me on the way over here." And I was like, "Wow, God knows, obviously God knows, but, he revealed."
Yeah.
And then I got deflated. Then she said, "God said you're writing that for yourself and not for him, and he's called you to write." Uh, and so I just let it go, and it was really about 30 years before Be Healed was written, and so it was,
Wow.
actually, the Ave Maria Press reached out to me. I was already discerning. We were teaching the Healing the Whole Person conferences, and they reached
Mhm.
out and they asked me if I would publish a book. And, then I knew it was time. There was a lot of other factors, but I knew it was time, and it's really focused on, 3 parts. One is who Jesus is. The very beginning is focusing on the person of Jesus as healer, and that everything he does and teaches is healing. And then the second part is on our woundedness, our brokenness, and a perspective of us as whole persons. And then the third part is on the healing journey through redemptive suffering and sacraments and prayer. And, I tell a lot of my family story, through the book also. So there's some
Beautiful.
really powerful, beautiful stories.
Beautiful. Well, I'm excited to dive into our conversation. Let's just jump right in.
Right.
My first question for you would be, if you could share maybe what are some of the most common wounds or areas of hurt that you see in marriages?
Yeah, actually, in marriage, there's hurts that are before marriage that are brought into the marriage, and then there are ways that couples hurt each other, and it can be betrayal, rejection, ways of, uh, feeling abandoned, all that. But even deeper than that are the kind of the universal wounds that men and women have from the fall. And if you study this, really got focused through John and Stacy Eldridge and their book Captivating, where they talk a lot
Mm.
about this. But we incorporate it into our marriage conference, and it's if you look at what Adam and Eve were called to do, and then the curses that came. The curses for Adam was related to his work, and the curses for Eve were related to family,
Yep.
children and spouse. And so the Eldridges developed this understanding that because of the toil, both of them labor now because of the fall, because grace is missing. And so the man labors in his work, and the wound is inadequacy,
Mm,
right? There's a sense of whatever it is I'm called to do, I can't do it well enough because the grace is missing.
yes.
And for the woman, it's relational. It's regarding husband and children because she's there as a relational, uh, creation. Not work is secondary for her, not that she doesn't work
Yeah.
just as much or more as the man, but it's secondary to her identity.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times men and women miss each other from those 2 different perspectives. And, a typical conversation might be a woman being more aware of the loneliness in the relationship, and she goes to her husband and says, uh, I feel like you're neglecting me. I feel like you're not really in tune with me right now or the kids."
Right. Yeah, like there's like expressing a disconnect. Like women are
Just
more aware of those, yeah, of those emotions.
Yep,
Totally.
yep. And so the husband being more aware of his own coming from his own woundedness and his own orientation, hears that as you're not doing it good enough,
Ah, yes.
right? Which taps right into his inadequacy.
There it
And
is.
now the dance starts, right? Because
Yep.
because now it becomes defensiveness and more disconnection rather than hearing the heart of his wife. And the wife now feels more disconnected, more hurt. It usually ramps it up in terms of her upset, which then increases more of a sense of inadequacy. And then now the disconnection has really escalated and the inadequacy has really escalated. So I think that's a dynamic that I saw a lot in my marriage therapy where we just miss each other. And I saw it also in my marriage. We just miss each other because our orientations were different, our wounds were different. And those wounds kind of invisibly playing out without any of us knowing really that we're living from our woundedness rather than from the conversation.
Totally. I mean, just hearing that, that was, I know, like step one, just like the basics, but I'm sure so many couples listening to this are just chuckling to themselves, like, oh, yeah, we've had that conversation before, you know? Oh, I
Yeah.
totally heard my wife said that, or I've totally been the one to say that. And it does give you a little bit of empathy and understanding for your spouse to kind of hear like, where is this rooted in? Where did this come from? Or, as a woman, when you do say like, hey, there's a disconnect, and husband replies like, "Whoa, I'm trying my best. I'm doing everything I can." You kind of get to see like, wow, it's really coming from this core place of, yeah, of inadequacy, or this core place of there being a break in that relationship. So that's really good insight. What if couples don't have the language, to identify this? What if they've never heard these terms like inadequacy, like, or woundedness? How can couples begin to identify and name wounds in themselves or in their marriage if they're not maybe immediately obvious to them?
Yes, it's part of the reason for writing Be Healed and Be Devoted is to give language, because I think that's where we all struggle. We're kind of blindsided by these things without being a name them. And again, going back to Genesis, right away God invited Adam to name things, to name the animals, to do that.
And
And there's something about naming that gives us some sense of not only awareness, but ability to deal with those things. So a couple that doesn't have this language, I think there's an intuitive knowledge that something's not okay, and it's that struggle. And I think the thing that's most important is that there be an ability to look out for the other's interest, as the scripture says. To be able to see things from the lens of the other, which is what communication is. Communication is the process of becoming one. Is being able to share my reality, my perception of reality, and you being able to share your perception of reality, and then to find a language together that we can understand with each other.
Mm. Yeah, totally. Because I do, and I remember this. That kind of reminds me of an exercise we did at the Unveiled retreat, where we practiced expressing a thought or concern, right? And then your spouse repeating it back to you to kind of, yeah, find that common ground of like, we're speaking the same language, like we're understanding each other. And I found that to be helpful. I still feel like, what would your advice to couples be if they're like, I know there is healing that is needed, but I don't even know what's causing me to feel this way or where things are coming from? How can they maybe begin that process or begin to kind of name things if they're just kind of like, I don't even know, where to start?
Yeah, and even though the man can be the one, it's often the woman's intuition, the woman's sensitivity to the relationship that begins to explore that. I would say the first step
Yeah.
is prayer. Uh, just
Okay.
before you go to your spouse, go to the Lord and say, "Okay, I'm having a hard time identifying what's wrong here, but I can feel something's not right. And so will you let me know?" And in that prayer, then be aware of your own heart. And what's really important, and it's so natural to do the opposite, but what's really important is that we don't blame our spouse, but we begin to examine what's going on inside of us. Right from the very beginning, if you remember, again, going back to the book of Genesis, God comes to look for Adam and Eve so that they can express and be reconciled to him and to each other. And instead, they start blaming each other. Uh, and that blame leaves them more alienated
Yeah.
and more disconnected and more ashamed. And
Yeah.
so it's so important that we pray to identify and then share it in a way that's sharing our experience rather than blaming or projecting it onto our spouse.
That's so good. I guess that kind of brings me to my next question too, as marriage is two individuals coming together and two broken individuals coming together. And so they're just, there's a lot of brokenness in each of our hearts. And as you come together, that begins to come out. And sometimes, within the marriage, husbands and wives can kind of contribute to that woundedness or that hurt. How do you feel like husbands and wives are contributing to this? And then how can we kind of be aware of that and then begin to support the healing instead of, contributing to the wound?
Yeah, those are big questions, and
Yeah,
make all the difference in a marriage. Uh,
absolutely.
so let me just first identify as you talk about brokenness, I think of 3 kinds of brokenness.
Okay.
One is our sin, right? Our personal sin that has wounded ourselves through the course of our life. And then that sin also wounds our spouse. So we need to
Mm,
become aware of and confess our sins regularly and be willing to grow in holiness, grow in, overcoming those sins. The second is the basic selfishness that's a part of fallen human nature, that we're much more aware of what we need than what our spouse needs. And we're much more likely to fight tooth and nail to get what we want than to fight tooth and nail to give you what you want. That doesn't mean that's exclusive, but that's part of our brokenness is that basic selfishness. And then it's all the
yeah.
wounds that we've experienced, because every time we're not loved well throughout our whole life, we develop wounds, whether we're aware of it or not. And all of that becomes part of the stew, if you will, uh, of a marriage
Yeah.
relationship. And so becoming aware of that internally and with each other, just acknowledging that, we're two sinners. We're more than sinners, but we're two people who hurt each other through sin. We're two people who have a propensity to be selfish, and we're two people with wounds. And again, as a man, it took me a while, even though I had pretty serious wounds, it took me a while to come to a recognition that I had wounds. And
Mm,
in pride, I wanted to deny,
mhm.
like my spouse's sins are obvious to me, but mine aren't. Uh,
Yeah.
And my spouse's selfishness is evident to me, but mine isn't, and so it's that growth and humility and awareness, and then from there, taking responsibility. And we talk a lot in our marriage conference about what a healthy process of forgiveness looks like and what a healthy process of reconciliation and rebuilding trust looks like. And so I think those skills are really important once we become aware of those areas.
Yeah. Talk to me more about forgiveness. I think that's hard for a lot of us, both in the area of forgiving those who have hurt us, as well as asking for forgiveness. How can couples practice forgiveness more in a genuine way? Or what would you like to speak into in this area of forgiveness and how this can really be a pivotal part of the healing process?
Yeah, it is so crucial, and sometimes forgiveness is a daily thing in marriage. If there's a annoying habit or pattern of behavior that continues on, and sometimes it's just something big that's happened that we haven't gotten over yet. But in either case, um, I think people need to start and begin to look at the consequences of not forgiving so that they recognize the motivation to forgive. So, and again, this is from the scriptures. What happens when we don't forgive is we form a judgment of the other person and we harden our hearts. Bitterness develops,
Mm.
resentment, right? So all of a sudden, the capacity to give and receive love and trust has been interfered with at some level, either at a really large level, if it's a big betrayal, or at a
Yeah.
small level, if it's a little betrayal. But it's like the difference between a venial sin and a mortal sin. Sometimes these broken areas of trust can really shatter the trust in a relationship, like an infidelity, or somebody going and spending it, all kind of money without the consent of the other spouse. That would also be a betrayal. These are all
Mhm.
situations I ran into in marriage counseling. And
Yeah.
when those are present, we can't just get over the issue. There's a big healing process, but it begins with working towards naming what's happened and naming the consequences of what's happened before we even start to forgive. And then moving from there into the process of forgiving. But as we talk about it, there's a whole lot involved in that forgiveness. It's letting go of the judgments, it's letting go of the wounds that I've experienced from it and the identity that I've taken in from that. And it's also, uh, recognizing that both of us have hurt each other, even if one person has hurt the other, we've both hurt each other. And it's unfaithful not just to be in adultery, but it's unfaithful to be judging and rejecting our spouse who we promised to love and cherish, right? So there's coming together in humility as two sinners, as two people who have brokenness and two wounds, to really repair the real damage that's been done, but the
Mm.
forgiveness then being a process. And I would often see in the marriage counseling, it would take a year or 2 for that to happen. So a lot of times one
Uh,
spouse having a major offense wants to be forgiven and then just forget about it, and that's unrealistic because trust has to be restored, and that's the other part of the process is how do you restore trust? And it's by a change in behavior, but also over time that behavior being trusted, and then it's accountability, and it's a recognition to the depth of the hurt that we've caused to the other.
mm,
And so that's true also in littler issues, but we can go along with the littler issues and ignore them and not realize that our hearts are starting to harden and we're pulling back and we're holding on to things.
yeah. No, absolutely. You mentioned, this phrase like forgive and forget. I feel like that's something you grow up hearing sometimes. And I'd love to just kind of hear, like, what is your take on that? Do you feel that that is a healthy practice or you're like, that's just not real, you know?
I will stand on the official teaching of the church where it says, uh, "It is not possible to forgive and forget an offense."
Mm,
We do not forget. It may be less conscious to us after we've, forgiven, and we may not bring
mhm.
it up again, but we don't like, if we're offended until it's healed, we're not gonna let it go. It's gonna be in our consciousness the whole time. Uh,
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
unrealistic.
Yeah. Um, in terms of rebuilding trust, what are some ways that you can kind of rebuild trust with your spouse if it has been broken? Are there any like little things we can be doing, or is it just really about being honest in all ways, or do you have any advice in yeah, the realm of like rebuilding trust?
Yeah, so trust has to do with 2 primary things. It has to do with truth and love, right? Am I being honest with you, or am I withholding things from you? If I'm honest with you, and I'm honest with you in love, not in brutality, but if I'm honest with you in love, and you can trust my word to be true because my behavior is consistent with that word, then trust will develop. But if I'm either
Mm.
dishonest or if I'm saying things that I'm not living, then naturally the trust is going to be broken. So that's on one hand. The second is on love. And so we're wounded by offenses against love, whether they're neglect or uh, more direct kinds of woundings. And so we can't rebuild trust unless that love wound is repaired. And how is that repaired? By consistent behavior of overcoming what we did before. And it's natural
Mm.
for people to not trust. And I would say each of us will trust our spouse to the extent to which each of us has a close relationship with Jesus, an authentically close relationship with Jesus, because to live in communion with Jesus is to live in love and truth. And
Mm.
without that, if one spouse has a deeper intimacy with Jesus than the other, very likely that person is going to be more trustworthy in the relationship than the other.
Wow. Wow, yeah, that is beautiful, and I mean, makes a lot of sense. I don't feel like I've ever thought about it that way, but you're right, because especially in our marriage, like, it's all gonna flow. Our love is going to flow, and our service to our spouse is gonna flow from that relationship with Jesus, like Jesus pouring into us, his grace into us, his love into us, his forgiveness into us, his trust into us, everything that we don't deserve, right? It's such an
That's right.
unconditional love. When we are united to Christ and are receiving that from him, we're able to then, be that channel that like allows his love to flow through us in trust and forgiveness to our spouse.
That's very true. And it's unforgiveness, the catechism says, that blocks that flow.
Mm,
And so it's
mm,
even though Jesus is constantly pouring out that mercy and forgiveness, the
mhm.
catechism says love is indivisible. We can't love God and not love the person who's next to us. And so if we have unforgiveness in our hearts toward that person, what's happened is the flow of that love and mercy has been blocked by the barrier of
Yeah,
unforgiveness, and our hearts then become hardened.
yeah. Wow. Um, what are some activities or exercises that you can recommend to spouses to deepen their connection and trust and foster vulnerability? I think this is something, vulnerability, especially something I have found in working with other couples that even is hard in marriage,
It is.
So some things even as simple as, praying with each other openly can be a challenge because you have to be vulnerable in what you would say to the Lord, to say that out loud with your spouse, or it can be really vulnerable to admit the faults you see in yourself and share that with somebody. Um, yeah, or maybe if there is this disconnect that they're feeling, but they're not really sure why, what advice do you have of ways that spouses can kinda deepen that connection and foster vulnerability?
Yeah, let me just recommend, because 'cause we're not gonna cover all of them, book Be
Of
Devoted,
course.
because
Okay.
that'll go into a lot of those things, but in Be Devoted and also in The Unveiled, I talk about 5 different forms of communion building activities, and they're kind of in a hierarchy in terms of what's foundational and then what builds on that. So the first of those,
Perfect.
as you're saying, is praying together, and as we all know, it's vulnerable to pray together if our prayer is really genuine. If it's
Right.
coming from the heart. And so in the conference and in the book, I have people just pray the Our Father together, but to personalize it. So you take what's already common, but personalize it. Like, uh,
Mm.
Our Father, we're children before you. Hallowed be your name. We're praising you together.
Mm.
May your kingdom come and your will be
Yeah.
done in our marriage as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. We give you all these areas that we're worried about, that we're anxious about, all of our needs, and we bring those to you together. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive each other.
Mm,
Lead us not into temptation that would pull us away from each other or away from you, and deliver us from any evil that has taken a hold in our life. See, can you feel the difference when we start to pray it that way?
yeah,
What
yeah, there
happens?
even just that, there is another layer of intentionality and intimacy that comes out because, yeah, you're putting your own life into that prayer. That's a really good exercise.
Yeah, and then just to bless our spouse and be thankful, be grateful for uh, the gifts that we have, and be specific. Uh, Next one was with building emotional intimacy, which you mentioned before, which is
Yeah,
being able to share the joys and the sorrows in my life. And to do that, we have to feel safe. We have to feel emotionally safe, just like in prayer, but even more so. And doing prayer together helps build that safety so that we can enter into that kind of vulnerability to say, this happened to me today, and
right.
I'm just really sad about it. Or, you know, our little one was so cute today. It just brought me so much joy to hear him, just talking about these new discoveries and seeing that bird outside, and, just that sharing at that level brings such
Mhm.
intimacy, and doesn't have to be hard sharing. It can just be honest sharing for each other.
Yeah,
And then, um, sometimes then it's important to get to the more difficult issues, right? Which is where we have to really work things out, and we call this, building teamwork and conflict resolution in the teamwork. And that requires letting go of control and a submission and really being able to hear each other's interests. And then the companionship is just spending time together. That's what builds connection. If there's not a lot of resentment there, being together, being around each other, working together, playing together. And then our sexual intimacy should be the fruit of all of that.
right.
It is and can be the most intimate body, soul, and spirit experience. But if we're not connected spiritually or emotionally or resolve the problems, then there's this disconnect between our bodies and what they're expressing and our hearts. And that's a terribly vulnerable thing to come into a
Mm,
relationship where you don't have trust and you don't have connection, to be naked with each other in that way, to be vulnerable in that way. Uh, so
absolutely.
all of those require vulnerability, but vulnerability requires trust.
Yeah. I remember in the Unveiled retreat, one activity that stood out to us, but it seemingly, like, was so much deeper, to everybody around us than we all thought it was gonna be, was the eye contact
Yeah,
exercise,
yeah.
where we were challenged to hold eye contact for 2 minutes,
Right. For
without
5
breaking
minutes.
eye contact,
For 5
or
minutes.
for 5 minutes,
That's good.
yes.
It felt like
Eh
2 to you.
For
For
5
some, it
minutes,
felt like an hour. Yeah.
I bet. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, what's funny is we were like, were we 3 years, maybe 2.5 years into marriage, and so we were like, "Oh, we don't need to go," like, we're just gonna be the super lovey couple, but we've heard of JP2 healing, and so we're like, "Okay, like, we know this is gonna be a great retreat, we're gonna go." And when they said this, exercise, I remember being like, "Oh, like, we're gonna be so good at this, like, we love, like, intimacy, and, like, we're just so happy and in love, like, newly married," and I cried, and I was like, "Why am I crying?
Mm.
Why am I crying right now?" But, like, something stirred in our hearts, just actually taking the time to look at each other, undivided attention, not looking away, and looking with intentionality and love, and just that. I think what we experienced was just that, like, that communication of, "All my love and attention is devoted to you right now."
Yeah,
My woman's heart was like, "Wow,
yeah.
this is everything I've ever wanted." And it is a challenging exercise, but really beautiful, and I think, honestly, a lot can be revealed from doing it.
Yes, and oftentimes couples are giggling and nervous at the beginning of that, and then as they settle into it, as you described, it's just such a beautiful connection and peace that comes and, and a safety with it, it's like, "Oh, you do love me. Ah, we are
Yes.
connected." And both men and women
Yeah.
feel that. It's not just the women who feel it, both feel that.
Right, right. Well, let's move on to maybe couples who feel stuck in this process. Maybe they've tried to kind of open communication about maybe family wounds that are coming in or coming out in their marriage, or they're trying to step into this healing process, but they're finding that they're stuck. What are some maybe practical ways that they can take to move towards healing? Or maybe they're stuck on not even being able to talk about it, maybe like to move towards communication. How can couples move into this?
There's a lot of different reasons why people can be stuck, but I think the biggest one that I hear from people is, "My spouse just isn't willing to address these things with me, and what do I do?" There's a real helplessness there with that.
Hmm.
And so the beginning is just acknowledging that, and again, bringing that to prayer. So it's everything because the sacrament is with Christ and each other, he needs to be the central person in the relationship throughout the whole relationship, not just at the wedding ceremony, which is why
Yes.
prayer and worship together is so important. And so it's bringing that to him and
Mm.
saying, "I'm stuck here. I feel helpless. I feel hopeless. I don't know what to do." And sometimes it's just staying in that and staying in the loneliness of that with Jesus so that there's relationship there and there's a loneliness in the spouse, but you're interceding for your spouse.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's a recognition that, "Oh, I'm beginning to develop a resentment here, and I need to forgive, and I need to receive
Mm.
forgiveness, and I need to bring that to confession." Sometimes it's every time I try to communicate that, my spouse is hearing blame rather than hearing my heart. So, Jesus, how
Yeah.
can I express what's going on? And sometimes it's a recognition that the spouse just isn't in a place where they can deal with it, which is the most difficult.
Totally.
And then I think of what St. John of the Cross says, "Where love is missing, bring love," right?
Mm.
It's love and truth that brings safety, but truth that builds up and not tears down, right? So how do I speak truth that builds up in love? And sometimes when the truth can't be received, how do I just love? And that's really difficult in marriage. When we make our marriage vows, they're unilateral and they're unconditional. We promise
Yeah.
to love dependent irregardless of what our spouse does. And so how do we love to create the safety? And so
Yeah.
oftentimes I'll give you one example. This is a very small example, but it was a really an eye-opening experience for me. So there was a situation where Margie and I were in the living room and she said something that was hurtful. And
Mhm.
I closed off in hurt and some anger, and I began
Yeah.
to walk down the hall towards our bedroom, and I started to pray and ask God what he wanted me to do. And I heard, "Turn around and wash your feet." And it was like,
Wow.
"Wash your feet, turn around." She just hurt me, that felt so vulnerable and so unfair. Uh,
Yeah.
and I knew that Margie wouldn't have liked it if I got a bucket and washed her feet, but I understood
And
that to mean go serve her.
serve her.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and one of the things that she did love, and this connection with the feet, is she loved me to rub her feet. So I
Ah.
walked back into the room, and by this time, my heart had changed because I really heard the Holy Spirit, and I went from self-protection to love. And so I went,
Mm.
sat down on the edge of the couch where she was watching TV, and I just started to rub her feet. And in the middle of that, she looked up with tears in her eyes, and she said, "Why are you doing this? I'm the one that hurt you."
Oh.
And I said, "I just want you to know that I love you." And she
Mhm.
just melted, and the whole thing just disappeared. It was
Absolutely.
it was gone. So love
Well,
is the greatest power that we have, and it's when we're hurt, we wanna be loved, and it's good to wanna be loved, but we always need to choose love no matter what the hurt is.
that is a very powerful reminder, and I think, um, just reminds me of something that we kind of realized early on in our marriage as things started to come up, that we were like, wow, our responsibility is to be the face of the Father as best as we can to our spouse, like to show the mercy and love of the Father
Yeah.
to our spouse.
Yes.
And the reality is the love of the Father and the mercy of the Father, while He is just, that love is, we're not just to receive it, right? In our brokenness and our sinfulness of turning away from the Father, like, we haven't done anything to really earn that love.
Mm.
It has been Him that just gives it freely and gives us mercy and His love freely over and over and over again. Um, and we have an opportunity in marriage, I think, yeah, to kind of show that to our spouse.
Yeah.
So that was really beautiful and powerful. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
such a gift that you start your marriage that way, because for most of us, we get into those situations and we want to receive the grace but not give it. So
yeah.
that's
Yeah. Especially when you feel like it's unfair,
that's unfair.
like,
Yeah.
they hurt me. I have no
Yeah.
reason to be the one to show this
Yeah.
love. But your story, it just reminded me, we had a similar situation. We were in an argument very early on in our marriage, and I was just angry and I was walking away and I felt my heart harden, and I felt the Holy Spirit be like, this is an opportunity to show the love of the Father, like to show the mercy of the Father. And you don't want that right now, but this is going to reveal the heart of the Father to your husband, who is having a hard time believing that,
Yes.
you know?
Yeah.
So what a gift that we have, but it really, like, you keep bringing it back to prayer. And I love that you do, because that's something I talk about so much in my ministry and my content, is how important our individual prayer lives are, as well as bringing that into our marriage and building kind of a prayer life in our marriage as well, because we're not going to be able to listen to those promptings of the Holy Spirit or be obedient enough to follow them if we're not rooted in our prayer and our relationship with God.
So true. Very true.
So what if spouses are in different places in their healing journey? Maybe one is like really ready to dive into it and the other one feels more resistant. What is the best way to approach your spouse? Do you give them more space and wait till they're ready? Or do you try and encourage them and say, like, no, like, I'm ready. Like, this is super important. Let's jump in. What is the best route there?
Yeah, I think it needs to be worked out individually with every couple, because each of those situations are different. But just kind of as principle, to go back to the love of the Father and who Jesus is. Jesus is the ultimate bridegroom who never
Hmm.
forces himself on the bride, right? He never forces us into a level of relationship that we're not ready to go to or willing to go to with each other.
Yeah.
So he can invite us, but not coerce us. And so it's to be able to become aware in ourselves where our inviting is coercive. And I can look at lots of situations in my marriage where I was trying to get Margie to be or to do something that I wanted her to be because I needed it, where she wasn't there. And those are really frustrating and lonely places when we're trying and it's not being communicated. And I'm sure there are
Hmm.
just as many places on her end. But in that, it comes back to the basic sense of respect. How do I respect the freedom of my spouse?
Yeah.
I can offer, like, with hands open, I can offer this desire, but I can't grasp at and pull it from them,
Mhm.
demand it from them, because then that becomes disrespectful. And it's so hard in a marriage when we're hurting not to do that, you know?
Yeah,
But again,
totally.
it's that trust and intercession and continuing to intercede. And some prayers aren't answered for a long, long time,
Yeah.
but God promises to answer prayers, and while He's doing it, He's working on our heart, and that's what's really important, is we can always be in a process of healing even if our spouse isn't willing.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing is love always heals. So when we choose to love, we're always bringing healing into our marriage.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like the simplest answer, but the hardest,
It is the
truly,
hardest.
like, the hardest to live out for sure.
Yeah.
Uh, Dr. Bob, thank you so much. My last question would be, what advice
Yes.
do you have for couples who feel like maybe their wounds are too deep to overcome, or there has been too big of a hurt that they can't get over. Couples that are kind of in this last resort area where they're just like, I don't know how we're going to move forward. What advice would you have, or what would you want to say to them?
Nothing is impossible for God. Um, I have, both in marriage counseling and in our unveiled conferences, I have had couples come who, that's it. This is, we're getting divorced after this, or we've been
Yeah.
divorced, and what do we do? And I've seen God come through over and over again. I've seen situations where they haven't cooperated with what he's doing and they don't reconcile, but I've seen so many situations, even couples who've been divorced for several years get healed and reconciled. So if things are intolerable, sometimes there needs to be a separation within the home so that you're not
Mm,
constantly creating more while both of you are getting help, uh, individually, if not together.
yeah.
Uh, Sometimes it's necessary to get separation out of the home, although I often see couples just do that as a preparation for divorce, and that's that's
Hmm.
not that's not the advice I would give most of the time. I think it's best to continue to be present, but if there's really damage happening and it's really abusive, sometimes that's necessary. Um, Divorce as an ultimate thing, in the church, if it's a sacrament, we're still married. But if it's necessary to protect the children or protect against serious abuse, that can be. But if couples just get in a breakdown and it feels hopeless and they've hurt each other, I've seen so much restoration and redemption in those situations when couples are willing, even when one person's willing. Uh, I'll give you an extreme example. Uh, and this upsets a lot of people because it's so extreme, but it's real. A woman came to me, her husband had sexually abused their daughters,
Mm,
and she had separated from him, hadn't divorced, and she
yeah.
came from help in another city. And she got to a place where she dealt with all of the pain of the wounds for her and her daughter and was able finally to forgive her husband. And then she didn't want her husband to go to hell, so she invited her husband to come and join us in the therapy. So I worked with him for a while. He had a hard time forgiving himself. He hated himself, couldn't bear looking at that. But once it was her mercy and love that allowed him to enter into the process. He was then able to go to confession. He was then able to sit down with his wife and with the daughters and repair do the best he could to repair the damage with those situations. That marriage was reconciled. That family was reconciled after several hard years of working. If you ever think of a hopeless situation, that would be it, right?
Yeah,
And so
absolutely.
what that taught me is that there's nothing God can't forgive, and there's nothing that God can't redeem if people are willing. And sometimes it's a lotta struggle to get there.
Wow. Wow. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing all this and just all the wisdom. And you can just tell that you have such a heart for couples and marriages and restoring families. So it's such a gift what you're doing, and your ministry is blessing so much of us.
Thank
Thank you for coming on here and spending time with us today. I know this conversation is going to be such a great resource for couples. These topics can be sensitive and hard to bring up and hard to talk about. So I know that this is just going to be a great resource for people to strengthen their marriage and maybe begin their healing journey. Where can our listeners find more of you, or find your books or your retreats and everything in your ministry?
uh, on the John Paul II Healing Center, uh, website, and then also at other places, but that's one where you can help support the ministry while you do that. Also, I have a couple new books coming out, uh, 3 of them actually.
Wow.
One of them will be great for couples, to do as a Bible study together or just to read together and share together, but it's called Trusting Our Father's Provision, and it's looking at that whole area of our financial life and our stewardship of time, talent, and treasure. But how do we come as children of the Father in trust and see Him come through? And there's beautiful stories of the way He's done that. in the lives of the saints and in my life and friends' lives and stuff. Then the other one is a book of prayer. So it's a book of healing prayers, and it can
Beautiful.
fit into a little prayer book or a breviary or anything else. And it's just all the prayers we use in our ministry, just there at your fingertips. And then the third one is Beloved Son. My daughter Carrie, who we mentioned before, wrote Beloved Daughter, which is a beautiful book for parents and grandparents to read to their daughters, younger daughters,
Mhm.
probably. And then this is Beloved Son. And so it's looking at our identity through the eyes of the Father and blessing our children in that identity, which is really creating the foundation for that restoration.
Mm. Amazing. So many great resources. We'll make sure to link those all in the show notes so people can find all that, your ministry, your books, and everything. Thank you so much for your time today, Bob.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you for what you're doing too. I feel like we're partners in the field. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yes.